You don't belong here. Pack your things. This stops today. Those words hit me like cold water. I was standing in my own front yard holding 2 bags of groceries, and my neighbor was pointing at my house like it was a mistake. A police cruiser rolled slowly up to the curb. Neighbors peeked from their windows, and then the officer asked for the deed. And everything changed. My name is Delia. I'm 37 years old. I work as a licensed occupational therapist. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, it's meaningful, and it requires the kind of patience and precision that most people underestimate. I help people rebuild function in their lives after injury or illness. I am, by nature, a practical woman. I solve problems, I don't create them. 2 years ago, my grandmother passed away and left me her house. She was the one person in my life who never needed me to prove myself. She just believed in me, quietly and completely, the way only a grandmother can. The house she left me is modest. Small front porch, an old oak tree in the yard, rooms that still smell faintly of her. But it is mine, paid off. Deed in my name. No mortgage, no landlord, no one to answer to. I moved in quietly. I introduced myself to a few neighbors, kept my yard clean, waved when people walked by. I wasn't loud, I wasn't confrontational. I wasn't the kind of woman people expected to fight back. That was their first mistake. I noticed early on that I was younger than most people on the block, that I was a single woman, and that certain neighbors seemed to regard my arrival as something that disrupted an order they'd grown comfortable with. I told myself it was just an adjustment period. I told myself people would come around. But my grandmother didn't leave me that house so I could be pushed out of it. If you've ever worked hard for something, earned it honestly, and still had someone question whether you deserve to be there, then this story is for you. Delia's situation is one too many people recognize. You put in the work, you follow the rules, and somehow that still isn't enough for certain people. If that hits close to home, subscribe before we go any further, because we tell these stories every single week. And click like right now, it helps more people find stories like this one. Have you ever had someone try to make you feel small in a space that was yours? You're not alone. The trouble started 3 weeks after I settled in. My next-door neighbor, Roy, was in his 60s, retired, and had apparently appointed himself the unofficial authority of the entire block. At first, his comments were small. My trash bins were in the wrong spot. My porch light was too bright. I adjusted both. I didn't want friction. I assumed this was just how things worked on a tight-knit street where people had known each other for decades. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I learned that Roy had circulated a letter to the other neighbors. In it, he described concerns about community standards and referenced a new resident who was, in his words, unfamiliar with how the block operated. He framed it as general guidance, something neighborly and reasonable. But buried in the language was a clear implication that I was a renter, not an owner. That I didn't have a real stake in the street. There is no HOA on our block. Roy had no authority to write that letter. He created it from nothing, gave himself a title he was never given, and distributed it to people who had no reason to question him, and they believed him. I found out because of something I overheard. I was walking past Roy's driveway one afternoon when I caught part of his conversation with another neighbor. Roy's voice carried. "She doesn't have any real stake here," he said, casual as anything. "She'll be gone in 6 months." I stopped walking. I stood there for a moment, completely still. Then I went home. I pulled out every document my grandmother had left me, the deed, the will, the transfer paperwork, all of it, clean and airtight, every signature notarized, every date confirmed. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me and understood something clearly for the first time. Roy wasn't confused. Roy knew I owned the home. He had always known. He was making a choice, deliberately and repeatedly, to erase that fact. And the question that sat heavy in my chest that night was simple. How far was he willing to take this? I got my answer quickly, and it came in layers. The first betrayal happened when I discovered Roy had organized a block improvement meeting. He printed flyers and walked them to every house on the street. Every house except mine. I found out from a kind elderly woman named Miss Patrice who lived a few houses down and who had assumed naturally that Delia had already declined to come. Why would she assume otherwise? She'd received a flyer herself. At that meeting, Roy had used my property as his primary example of what the block should not look like. My yard. My porch furniture. My car in my own driveway. He stood in front of my neighbors and criticized the home my grandmother had maintained for 40 years, and I wasn't there to say a single word in response. I didn't even know I was being discussed. The second betrayal came the following Saturday. I had decided to approach Roy directly and address the meeting calmly. I walked over while he was in his driveway. Two neighbors were nearby. I kept my voice even. I told him I understood he had concerns and that I'd like to talk through them like adults. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone who doesn't know their place. "Look, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "The people who've been here 20 years have a system. You should respect that before you start making demands." The word sweetheart landed like a slap across the face. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was calculated. It was designed to shrink me in front of witnesses, to signal to everyone watching that I was out of my depth. The two neighbors nearby said nothing. One looked away. I held my composure. I nodded. I walked back inside. But my hands were shaking, not from fear, from fury. And somewhere in that fury, something shifted. No more adjusting, no more quiet diplomacy. I was done making myself smaller to keep Roy comfortable. The third betrayal arrived by way of a city inspector who showed up unannounced at my door on a Tuesday morning. Roy had filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming my property had unregistered structural modifications violating building code. I had to take a half-day off work. I stood in my own home while a stranger walked through it with a clipboard. The inspector found nothing. Every modification on the property, all of which had been made by my grandmother years before I moved in, were fully permitted and documented. He apologized for the inconvenience and left. But the damage Roy intended was already done. Two more neighbors were now watching my house with a certain look. Doubt had been planted. Roy hadn't needed to be right. He had only needed to make people wonder. That evening, I opened a notebook and I began writing everything down. Every incident, every date, every name, every witness. I didn't know yet exactly how I'd use it, but I knew one thing clearly: I was going to need it. It was around this time that I started going through my grandmother's old filing cabinet properly. She had always been organized, but what I found went beyond organization. She was meticulous in a way that felt almost intentional in hindsight. Decades of records, property tax payments going back to the 1980s, permit approvals for every modification ever made to the house, neighbor correspondence, both formal and casual, even a few handwritten notes she'd made to herself about various issues on the street. And then I found a folder with Roy's address written on the tab. I sat down slowly and opened it. Inside were letters between my grandmother and Roy. The early ones were civil, almost friendly, but the tone shifted over time. Roy had attempted to buy the property from my grandmother. He'd offered more than once, the offers getting slightly more insistent each time. She had declined, firmly and clearly, every single time. Her final letter to him on the matter was 2 sentences long. She was not interested in selling, and she considered the matter closed. There was also a survey document in the folder, something I wouldn't have understood without context. It referenced a boundary dispute Roy had filed against my grandmother's property years ago. The claim had been dismissed. I called the county records office the next morning. I requested copies of all documents filed in connection with both properties over the past 30 years. The clerk told me it would take a few days. I said that was fine. I wasn't in a rush. What Roy didn't know was that my grandmother kept everything, and I mean everything. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. I simply waited. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building a case. There's a difference. Miss Patrice was the one who mentioned the lawyer. She was dropping off a cutting from her garden for me one afternoon, and we got to talking about my grandmother. Miss Patrice had known her for years. She mentioned, offhand, that my grandmother had always used the same attorney for property matters. A retired lawyer named Mr. Eldon Vassy, now in his 70s, still living nearby. I found his number through the County Bar Association's retired member directory. He answered on the third ring, and when I said my grandmother's name, his voice warmed immediately. He remembered her clearly. He said she had been, in his words, a woman of great precision. I explained everything that had happened since I moved in. Roy's letters, the false renter narrative, the city complaint, the boundary encroachments, the meeting I wasn't invited to. Mr. Vassy listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I need to tell you something about that boundary dispute." The dismissal, he explained, had not been a simple ruling. It had been dismissed with prejudice. That meant Roy could not refile the claim, ever, under any circumstances. Roy knew this. He had always known this. The boundary argument he kept gesturing toward, the one that made him act as though my property were somehow in question, was legally dead before I ever moved in. Mr. Vassie also told me that circulating written statements describing me as a renter when I was in fact the legal owner could, depending on context and provable damages, constitute defamation. He was careful, he wasn't making promises, but he wanted me to understand what Roy was actually risking. He gave me clear guidance before we ended the call. Document everything. Don't confront Roy alone, don't move 1 inch from that property. Roy, meanwhile, grew bolder. He began parking his car partially across my driveway, just enough to be a statement without being undeniable. He told a new neighbor who'd recently moved onto the block that Delia had been causing problems since she arrived. He enlisted a man named Carl who ran the neighborhood's social media page to post vague complaints about new residents not respecting community standards. The comment section filled up. People who had never met me, people who had only Roy's framing to work from, posted their frustrations freely. I read every single comment. My notebook grew thicker. Roy thought my silence meant I was backing down. It didn't. It meant I was ready. The city organized a neighborhood beautification day in early October. A community coordinator came out, volunteers walked the block, and a local news crew showed up to film a short segment for a community interest piece. Most of the neighbors participated. It was, on the surface, a pleasant Saturday morning. Roy was in his element. He moved through the event like a man who had been waiting for exactly this stage. He spoke to the coordinator easily, gestured up and down the block with the confidence of someone who believed the neighborhood existed because of him. And then he turned toward my property and made a comment to the coordinator. He said the home had been a problem before the current situation, keeping it just vague enough to sound like concern, just pointed enough to make sure everyone nearby understood what he meant. I was standing 20 feet away. I heard every word. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and clear, the way a decision feels when you've already made it and your body finally catches up. I walked over. I was dressed professionally. My voice was steady. I smiled at the coordinator and introduced myself by name. Hi, I'm Delia. I own the property at this address. I'd love to be included in today's coverage. Roy went completely still. The coordinator, who had no idea what she had just walked into, smiled and said of course. She invited me to say a few words on camera. I spoke about my grandmother. I talked about what the house meant to our family, how long she had maintained it, how proud I was to carry that forward. I kept it warm. I kept it genuine. The news crew kept the camera rolling. And then Roy made the move that undid him. Standing in front of the coordinator, 2 neighbors, and an active camera, he said there was some confusion about the actual ownership status of the property and that they had been having concerns. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my bag and produced a folder. I handed the city coordinator a copy of my deed. I handed her the county record confirming the boundary claim had been dismissed with prejudice. I handed her a copy of Roy's original letter to the neighbors, the one where he called me a renter. I handed her the permitted records for every modification on my grandmother's property going back 30 years. Then I turned to Roy. There's no confusion, Roy, I said. There never was. You knew exactly who owned this house. The coordinator took a small step back from Roy. Her expression had shifted entirely. Mr. Dudixteray. Vassie stepped forward from where he had been standing quietly at the edge of the gathering. He introduced himself by name, mentioned his background in property and estate law, and stated calmly that we had been documenting a pattern of harassment and defamatory statements for several weeks and that all records had been preserved. Roy said nothing. For the first time since I had moved onto that block, he had nothing to say. Then one of the neighbors who had stayed silent through all of it, one of the 2 who had been standing there the day Roy called me sweetheart, spoke up. She confirmed plainly and clearly that Roy had told her Delia was a renter, that she had believed him, that she was sorry she hadn't questioned it sooner. The camera was still running. Within the week, the city coordinator had formally reviewed Roy's complaint history against my property. Every single complaint came back with no violations found. The flag she had noted at the event went into the official record. Roy stopped parking across my driveway. The car was moved, permanently. The boundary encroachments stopped. Carl's posts on the neighborhood social media page disappeared quietly, no explanation given. The comment threads closed. Miss Patrice came to my door with a pie. She stood on my porch and looked at me with soft eyes and said, "Your grandmother would have loved that." A few of the neighbors who had been cold for months began to wave when they saw me. Small gestures, barely anything, but they mattered. Mr. Vassie and I discussed next steps. His advice was measured. Roy's behavior had been exposed publicly, documented thoroughly, and witnessed by a city official and a news crew. The likelihood of it continuing was low. Pursuing formal legal action was an option. But Delia, he said gently, you have to decide what your peace is worth. I decided my peace was worth more than prolonged conflict. I let it go. That evening, I sat on my porch. The old oak tree was turning, its leaves catching the last of the October light. The deed was on the table beside my coffee, not because I needed to look at it, but because it felt right to have it there. In the open. In the air. On my porch. In front of my house. Some people see a woman alone and think, easy target. They don't realize that the women who've learned to survive quietly are exactly the ones you should never underestimate. If someone has ever tried to make you feel like you don't belong somewhere you earned, whether that was a home, a job, a family, or a community, this story was made for you. Delia didn't shout. She didn't beg. She built her case brick by brick and let the truth speak at full volume when the moment arrived. If you've ever been dismissed, erased, or made to feel invisible in a space you rightfully owned, drop a comment and share your story. You deserve to be heard. And click like right now to help this reach someone who needs it today. Every week we bring you stories about people who were underestimated and chose to stand anyway. Real moments. Real stakes. Real outcomes. Think about someone in your life who has shown that kind of quiet, unshakable strength. Tell us about them in the comments below. And hit subscribe so you never miss a story that was made for someone exactly like you.